I'm sure many of you have heard about the Jersey Devil and even question its authenticity. As a local to the area and someone who has grown up in the small town nearby Brown's Mill, can testify that I have seen and heard things that I can't quite explain. I'm in my 40s now, and all my life people have told me accounts and stories they have had with the supposed Jersey Devil. Up until I was about 20 years old, I thought it was all tales to keep children out of the forest. But after things I've seen and accounts I've heard, I don't feel that way anymore. One of the first accounts I remember was when I was around 20 years old, and I was driving sometime during the evening. I believe the exact road I was on was Lakehurst Road. There's nobody else on the road at the time that I remember, and I faintly remember a strange screeching sound that sounded not too far away. Puzzled, it sounded like an extremely large bird, so I looked up. At about 50 feet up in the air was this giant, evil shape with wings and what looked to be a horse head. The thing that immediately caught my attention was the two glowing dots that were, I assumed, to be eyes that stared down directly at me, as if it knew I was looking up at it. All I remember seeing is black wings and the head and the eyes. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and I had a hard time convincing myself I wasn't hallucinating. This thing was flying slowly and made its way north until it was totally out of view, but stayed flying fairly low to the ground. I would say no more than 75 feet off the ground to be exact. This thing was enormous. The second time would have been in the winter, about 6 or so years ago. Late one night, we heard something land on the roof. It sounded like something heavy, like a rock fell on the roof, until we heard it walking around. We were terrified, thinking somebody was up on our roof. Whatever it was just walking around, and then it jumped down on the ground and sounded like it took off. It was dark outside, and we were too afraid to go out and check what it was until the following morning. We went to go investigate and found enormous prints in the snow and all over the top of the roof. Now you tell me why there was a horse 3 times normal size walking around on my roof. The steps also looked bipedal and did not match a quadruped step pattern, which really concerned me. For a while, I just pretended it didn't exist and ignored it. But I realized I can't do that anymore. I've had multiple friends who have had supposed run-ins and encounters with this thing as well, and now that I've had a few experiences of my own, I can't imagine the horror that they went through. If you're going to come into this area, and if you're not familiar with this thing, you need to be safe. I used to live in New Jersey, but have since moved to the West Coast to pursue a photography career in which I've become quite successful at. Luckily for me, I don't have any Jersey Devils in my day-to-day life, but my grandfather, unfortunately, was not so lucky. My grandfather, who has since passed away, told me of a story when he was around 13 years old that he had a face-to-face encounter with what he could only describe as something right out of hell. His story is that when he was just a boy, him and his parents lived outside of town and had a fairly large vegetable garden. He was the only one outside at the time, and he was tilling the soil, as was his usual chore, and keeping up on other garden tasks. As he was tilling the soil by hand, he heard a loud whoosh sound, and looked up to see this, what he could only describe as a demon with wings, and an elongated face flew down right in front of him. He said it was about 5 feet away when it landed. It could have reached out and grabbed him. He said this thing looked menacing and gave my grandfather the most evil look he's ever seen, like it was going to hurt him. He told me he screamed bloody murder and ran back to the house, and this thing let out a howl and flew up in the air. He tells me his parents didn't see or hear it, and ended up beating him because they thought he was making it up to try and get out of his chores. It really traumatized my grandfather because every time he brought it up, he would get really shaken up, and you could tell his voice would start to break and his eyes would welt. I've never encountered anything like it growing up, and I lived right near the Pine Barrens. But I can't dispute what he experienced. It still freaks me out to this day, just to think about. God only knows what he actually encountered that day gardening. I was on my way to work one early morning, driving on Range Road, which also becomes South Boundary Road. It's a 2-lane road with heavy forest on both sides. It was probably about 5:30 in the morning, and it must have been spring still because it was pretty dark out and the sun was just beginning to break. I was coming up on a larger bend in the road when my headlights shone on something huge jump down from the trees onto the road. As I approached closer, this huge mass that had jumped down stood up, and I immediately stopped my car. I full-on pissed my pants just staring at this thing. It looked like a massive bodybuilder, but it was pitch black. It had huge claws and weird haunched legs like a giant dog. I couldn't really see if it had hair. It was so black. It was humongous and had bat-like wings and what looked to be a deformed-looking horse head thing. The one thing I'll never forget is the intensity of its eyes and how full of malice they were. It never showed its teeth, but it just glared at me and stared into my soul. I've never felt more dread in my life and like I was going to die. This thing gave off terrible vibes, and I knew I needed to get out of there now. After about a minute of this going on, I slammed my car into reverse as fast as I could and nearly totaled my car. I pulled it in drive and got out of there so fast I probably burned out all of my tires just leaving. It never did follow me like I thought it would have, but I also never looked in my back mirror to see if it was. I got back to the house and ended up calling into work, sick. After that encounter, I ended up getting deathly ill later on that day and would be profusely vomiting for the next 6 to 7 days, and I actually ended up in the hospital for the last 2 of those days. I'm not sure what that thing was or what it did to me. I called it a demon. I've only told this to my friends, and they tell me it was the Jersey Devil himself. I don't know if that's what it was. All I know is that its intentions were evil. This event occurred in December of 2005. It had been a heavy snowfall for the past few days, so we probably had a good few feet of snow at the time. I remember staying up that night and playing video games when I heard ruckus outside, but I didn't think too much of it. I just kept playing video games, but it sounded like banging and clanging. And then I remember getting the distinct smell of sulfur, and it was incredibly strong. I started freaking out and wasn't sure what to do. I thought we had a gas leak or something. I ended up going to open the back door to see what was going on. It was so black I couldn't see anything. At the time, our porch light had been gutted because my dad was in the process of doing some renovations. I could still hear the ruckus and weird noises, and then I hear what sounds like a moose take off into the woods. I was scared but convinced myself it was just a large animal, and the sulfur smell? I assumed we had had a minor gas leak, and that it was gone. The next morning, my dad was asking me why I was outside banging around. I told him I wasn't, and that there was a large animal in our yard. My dad tells me we don't get moose up here in Jersey, and I started to freak out. We went outside, and sure enough, humongous hoofprints in the ground. My dad's reaction was rather surprising. Instead of being curious, he looked like he knew something. He was pale, and he told me I needed to stay in the house from now on. I didn't like his tone one bit. I'm 15 at this time, and what did I know? At the time, I was pretty ignorant about cryptids, Jersey Devils, etc. It wasn't until I was a little older I learned of such things, and so I asked my father about it when I was older in my 20s, and he told me he thinks one Jersey Devil came to terrorize him when he was younger. He told me he feared that this was the same one coming back for him. I was definitely spooked when he told me that. Luckily, I had already moved out for college, and my parents don't live in that house anymore, but you never know when it could come back. This happened just last year. Last summer, to be exact. I was driving with my family in the car on Shore Road out in Berkeley Township. Shore Road is this little long stretch of land that's kind of out in the bay, and on both sides is kind of thick shrubbery, I guess, and then coastline. I remember it was clear as day, probably in the afternoon sometime, and we were driving down this road. There were several other cars on the road, mind you. It's not a dead road at all. My dad is driving, and he's looking up at something, and then he asks us to look up with him, and then he asked, "What is that?" All of us were looking up at it, and we could not determine what it was. A few 100 feet in the air, it looks to be this huge floating shape of what we can only guess would be a horse with wings. It was solid black, and all we could see was the general shape. I didn't see any wings flapping or anything. It looks like it was literally just gliding smoothly through the sky towards land. My parents and I were in awe, and we thought, what on earth could that be? We are originally from Florida and just moved up here a few months prior to this happening. I did a little research after, and the only thing I could possibly find that points to anything feasible is a Jersey Devil. It didn't really scare me as much as it made me curious. It's the only thing I could think of. It was so huge, and the shape was pretty distinct, even from a couple 100 feet away. It's just weird how it wasn't actually flying, just kind of gliding across the sky. It's pretty windy out here too, and it didn't look like it was having any turbulence problems. It's like the wind didn't even exist to this thing. Like I said earlier, there was a bunch of other people on the road, so I'm sure we were not the only ones to see this thing. It was pretty visible if you looked up. This happened in August of 2018. I love to go hiking around with my best friend. My best friend being my German Shepherd, of course. Her name is Cindy. I'm 28, and I moved up here with my boyfriend, who got a job up here doing design and illustration work. We're originally from Cali, and we thought this would be a wonderful opportunity to get to explore the East Coast and the things it has to offer. I love me some hiking, and I always bring my German Shepherd with me. She's been my walking buddy for years. She's a really good dog. Very smart, and I always trust her sense of awareness more than my own. Animals, and dogs specifically, can sense things that we can't. We should always listen to their intuition, especially when out in the wild. I hadn't really come across a situation like this until just recently, when me and Cindy were hiking along in the woods. We're actually in the Pine Barrens to be exact, or at least very close to. We're walking along, and I noticed large prints in the ground that lead on. They were right at the base of a huge tree, and it kind of looked like something jumped down from the tree and walked off. You can tell these prints were quite weathered because the exact shape wasn't really there. You could see that it was a very large bipedal animal or footprints of some kind, if I had to guess. Maybe a dog or maybe a horse? They look more like a horse's than they did any human feet prints. I initially guessed bear and got nervous, but my dog wouldn't even go near those prints and was whimpering and pulling me in the direction away from them. Now, that really concerned me because we've been around black bear in California, hiking around, and my dog never acted like this. I knew something was wrong, and I kept asking her if she was okay, but she acted like she wanted to get the hell out of there. I looked at her face, and it just said danger, we need to leave. I'm no dog whisperer or anything like that, but I can sense when an animal is in fear. We turned around and left, and I didn't ask any questions. I don't know what those prints were. I didn't smell anything or even see anything, but I could see that the prints went on and on, deeper into the forest. Maybe Cindy was just freaking out. Maybe there's something more to it. I don't know what left those footprints, but it must have been heavy because the indent was pretty deep into the mud. My house is not all that far away from the Pine Barrens, and I'm here to tell you that from my experiences, something is living out in those woods. I know because every single night I hear it screaming and screeching like a banshee. The very first time I ever heard it, I was outside smoking a cigarette late at night, and I kept hearing rustling in the woods. It didn't sound like rustling though. It sounded like a herd of bears or something rummaging through brush. It was loud, and I began to hear this really strange, screeching animal sound. Howls, screeches, and clicks to be exact. I'm familiar with enough of the wildlife and animals around here that I know enough that there is no animal that makes those noises. Growing up, I remember hearing stories about a supposed Jersey Devil and that how during the night it stalked its prey, but I never really paid much attention to it. I'm not saying one out there might be making the howling sound is definitely a Jersey Devil, but something is out there howling away at night, and it scares me. It sounds huge, and it doesn't sound right. No animal I've ever heard of makes that noise. Apparently, it's not just me either. My neighbors have talked to me about hearing strange noises coming from the forest at night, and they ask me what I think it is. I've never actually gone in to explore and see for myself. And quite frankly, I don't want to. If a Jersey Devil exists, I don't want anything to do with it. If I leave it alone, hopefully it will do the same for me. I don't really like to talk about my story much, mainly due to criticism and lack of belief on people's parts. I don't like to be called crazy. I didn't ask for these scars on my body, nor to have been attacked. It's just what happened to me. However, for you, I will divulge the details so you can share with your viewers. I'm a night hiker. I know that might sound weird, but I've hiked thousands of miles all across the wilderness of North America, at nighttime specifically. I think there's just a certain beauty to going through the wilderness at night. Different animals are out, and I enjoy the challenge that low light visibility brings. I'm a thrill seeker, but I'm not scared of much. I understand many will perceive this as stupid because many predators are very active at night, like mountain lions and bear to be exact. While this is true, I keep myself armed with my trusty 308 Magnum, a loud Bluetooth speaker, and quite a few bright flashlights that reach anywhere between 1200 lumens to 1500. You would be amazed at how helpful a loudspeaker can be. Blaring music to ward away animals. You know, one of those little battery-operated Bluetooth speakers? They work great. Sometimes I'll do a variety of sounds, high-frequency noises to ward off predators, or just loud heavy metal music and blast it. Again, I have never had an issue. This particular night I was hiking though, I was going through some more marshier, swampier areas of the New Jersey coast, not far from Barnegat Bay. This was only a few years back, and this particular time, I was not playing any loud music or blaring any frequency noises. I was just traversing with my gear and my flashlights. By the way, my flashlights that I used were pretty expensive, and like I said, they were extremely bright. To get a high-end flashlight, they offer you generally around 1500 lumens, so I had some good gear on me. Anyway, I'm traversing through a marsh area when I began to hear some rumbling. It sounded like a low groan at first. I thought to myself it could be a black bear that I possibly disturbed. I pulled out my 308 and pulled the safety off. This baby is fully loaded, and I'm not a person to take chances, even though I night hike and take tons of chances, but I wasn't about to go down from a predator. All of a sudden, I hear brush breaking and cracking to my left, and I see this thing run right at me. It came at me so fast, I barely had time to react. I turned and fired one shot at this thing running at me. But by the time I had fired my shot, it was already within feet from me and slashed my entire side of my body up with one swipe of its claw. Then it darted back up into a nearby tree. I knew I shot it because it screamed and I saw blood. When it swiped at me, it also knocked me down onto the ground, and I'm bleeding profusely at this point. I'm shining my light, and I finally get a good look at my attacker. It looked like this tall, 9-foot tall, scrawny black, scaly thing. I don't know what else to call it. It had a horse's head and horns, and had these powerful eyes. I knew I wasn't dealing with a normal animal at that point. I pointed my weapon and fired again, and it screamed and ran off deeper into the woods. When I shone my light on it to look at it, I didn't see any blood or signs that I even hit it, even though it was 3 feet away and I shot it point blank in the face with a magnum. Something isn't right. I pulled myself up and got the bandages out of my backpack and patched myself up as best as I could. That's when I realized when I initially saw blood from the first shot, it was my blood. I was bleeding worse than I thought. Luckily, it hadn't punctured any real arteries or anything, but I got a pretty good gash from this thing. I ended up walking my way back to the nearest hospital where I just told them I was attacked by a mountain lion because I knew they wouldn't believe me. I still go hiking at night and do my usual routine. I don't know what it was that attacked me. I've heard about the Jersey Devil, but I don't care if it's a demon or a damn leprechaun. If it's flesh and blood, it can die, and this thing wasn't even phased. I shot it. Could it have been a Jersey Devil? I will never know. When I was just a little kid, my father and I were terrorized by what we can only describe as something from hell. I remember it had huge wings and had the body of a man, but with the head of a horse with horns. It had razor-sharp teeth like an alligator or something, and it even spoke to us. Me and my father were out saltwater fishing, off the coast of New Jersey. We had a smaller fishing boat and we weren't too far off from land. Not even half a mile that I could remember when him and I both see this large, black flying object coming toward us. It looked like a bat from far away, but as it got closer, it just got bigger and bigger. My dad and I were both freaking out because we didn't know what it was then, and as it was flying up in the air, it started aiming toward us. As it approached, we could tell it was evil. You could just feel the dread and hate coming off of this thing from far away. My dad and I began screaming. My dad was so scared he lost his line and rod in the water. This thing comes within 20 feet of us and just stops and hovers there in the air, glaring at us intently. I thought it was going to kill us both. It's weird because it wasn't flapping its wings or anything. It was literally just hovering there in the air without its wings moving at all. It's like it was being held up somehow. It didn't make any sense. It then reached out its arm and pointed its nasty claw right at me and looked over at my father and said, "Sacrifice." It barely opened its mouth, but it sounded just as you would expect some hideous demon that smoked so many cigarettes to sound. I fully released my bowels into my pants, and then this thing just turns quickly and flies off in the distance it came at incredible speeds. We got back to land fast, and my father abandoned saltwater fishing indefinitely after that. I'm in my later 30s now, and it's something that will never leave me. I still have night terrors about it often to this day, and I've tried to deal with it and process it my entire life. I always keep running through what it said to me. I don't understand why it said sacrifice. I'm terrified of what it could have done and wanted to do, so I just stay out of the area altogether of New Jersey. This event goes back in the mid-80s. I was young, in my early 20s, and was heavily into black magic and the occult. I had a group of friends. I guess you could say we were our own little coven because we casted spells and practiced rituals and witchcraft together all the time. We made sacrifices with small animals, even did some really minor stuff like rune castings. But we would also go out at 3 a.m. and do rituals and try to summon demons to go after people and hurt them. I have since moved away from that and I don't participate anymore. I have since become a Christian and have given my life to serving Christ, not the devil. I'm certain that on the night I'm telling you about, we summoned the Jersey Devil himself. It was in October. I believe it was the 1st. We didn't really do a whole lot of ritualistic stuff by the book, and we just did our own thing for fun, even though some of us were very knowledgeable in casting spells, incantations, and summoning. I remember going out into the pine barrens in the early morning hours of, I think, about 2 to 3 in the morning, and we had a blood sacrifice. I think it was someone's cat that we had kidnapped, tortured, and slit its throat as a means to summon a demon through blood. Well, that was the intent anyway. We all stood in a circle and did our spell and chant, and within minutes, the air became thick and staticky, and a powerful sulfur smell engulfed us. This being, at the time, I didn't realize it was the Jersey Devil, but this being manifested inside of our circle. It looked like it had faded into this dimension, or frequency have you. It was this massive, hulking thing, dark and black as could be, and what I could only describe as the most demonic-looking horse head you could have. It also had large bat gargoyle-like wings and talons on its feet and hands. I wasn't scared at the time because we thought we had control over it. It asked us telepathically why we called it and what was our intentions. One of the others declared that it wished for it to go terrorize and to victimize somebody they wanted to kill. This thing flew off faster than we could even see, and I don't remember too much after that. We had summoned demons before, so this wasn't anything new. If any of your viewers are witches or are into the occult and summoning, they will know and understand summoning demons and spirits and having them physically manifest isn't that big of a deal. It happens a lot more than you would even know. There are many secrets to the dark magics. For those that aren't into the occult and don't understand rituals, summoning evil spirits and demons to do dirty work is actually quite a common thing. We used to do it and send demons after Christians all the time, or send spirits of drug abuse, suicide, etc. out to different places we could. People think it's all a joke, but there's power in evil. There's power in being able to cast spirits and to be able to bend them to your will. What people don't realize is that there's a huge payoff. Anyway, that's my story, and I don't recommend anyone going out and trying to summon anything. God bless.